Greetings, Jeff Hyatt here, Universal Sampling. Going to demo Euphoria, which is a new library. I guess you could classify it as a hybrid library of sorts. It has a lot of percussive stuff, loops, single hits, kits. It has a lot of tonal stuff and other sounds and noises and impacts and lots of different things that you can use to create your own compositions from scratch, or that you can use to dot your orchestral compositions with, or whatever other compositions you happen to be working on. And let's start by taking a look at the GUI. This is the first page. You have volume and pan over here. The EQ section is over here. These three faders will control the amount of EQ. These three will control the frequency, and the bandwidth is controlled down here. We have a convolution reverb over here. It's all pretty self-explanatory. These are all the controls for the reverb. There are more effects on the second page, which is accessed by hitting this button down here. And that brings us to the filters, high pass and low pass. There is delay, distortion, rotator, and screamer. And all of these effects can be toggled on and off with these little radio buttons up at the top of each rack. The first instrument we're going to take a look at is the organic drum kit. The entire kit is 5 velocity layers, 6 round robin, and let's take a listen. We'll start with the kick drum. Then we have a snare. Then there's hi-hat, which comes in 6 different flavors or lengths. There's ride and ride bell. Six toms. And 3 crash cymbals. Let's take a listen to a short beat created with this patch. Then we have what I'm calling a destroyed drum kit, which is basically drums that have been heavily processed. There's kick, snare, and higher stuff, which would be the equivalent of, we'll say, hi-hat and ride. Let's take a listen. And you can, of course, use any of those sounds or even combine some sounds to make your own beats and grooves. Next, we have a Megatoms patch. This patch has a number of different toms. The way it's mapped is each tom is mapped to 3 separate keys without any pitch shifting. And this will allow you to play in your toms without having to worry about just having one key. So you'll have 3 different keys to play with. So the first tom is up here and comes in 3 different pitches. The next tom, also in 3 pitches, sounds like so. So both of those sets are 3 velocity layers and 6 round robin. And the next set is a set of 6 megatoms, if you will, and 6 different pitches. And all of these are 5 velocity layers and 6 round robin. In addition to that, we have some tom crescendo rolls. Let's take a listen to a short passage created with some toms. Next we have some cymbal effects, which are, well, cymbal effects, and they sound like this. Then we have 3 low booms patches, which, as you can imagine, are low booms, and they sound as such. So the next patch is an impacts patch, which I love. I think these sound great. For the most part, they have long tails. You can use volume automation to lessen the tail if you like. You can bring it down quicker than it decays naturally. Most libraries, what they do is they'll have a whole bunch of hits or impacts or whatever they call them, and they'll put them across several different patches, covering an octave and a half or 2 octaves or 2.5 or whatever it is. And this is kind of a pain in the neck, at least as far as I'm concerned, because you have to load one patch, you're dishing a bunch of hits, you don't like what you hear, you have to load another patch, and you load another patch, and if you want to combine different hits from different patches, you have to have the several patches loaded, you have to create a new MIDI channel, or route the second patch to the same MIDI channel, and it becomes a little cumbersome. So what I did is I combined all of the impacts in one mega patch, if you will. Everything is in one patch. There are a total of 86 of them, which spans just about the entire keyboard. One really cool thing you can do here is you can combine different impacts and different hits to create your own. And if you're going to do that, just one little word of warning, they tend to be kind of loud individually. So if you're going to combine different hits and stack them 3 and 4 on top of one another or even more, just bring down the volume a little bit first. So here we go. Next, let's take a look at our percussion loops. There are 2 different varieties. There's multiple or multi-percussion loops, and there are single percussion loops. Let's take a look at the singles first. So both of these instruments, single percussion loop 1 and 2, are mapped chromatically over the keyboard. They start at C1 and end at C7, and they will loop continuously until you release the key, and they will also sync to your host sequencer's tempo. All of these loops are also available as separate NKI files where you have mapped loop slices which enable you to rearrange some or all of the elements of the beat. I'm not going to go into a description of how that's done here. If you need some help with that, feel free to send me an email and I'll be happy to help you. So unlike the single percussion loops, where each loop is its own sample or zone, the multi-percussion loops are made up of several different samples or zones. Each loop is made up of usually 3 or 4, sometimes 5, I think a couple of times 2, separate loops that are stacked on top of one another, making one bigger loop, so to speak. This offers a great deal of flexibility when working with these loops. We'll get to that and how so in a bit. But first I want to talk about how the instruments are laid out. Both instruments, multi-perc 1 and 2, contain full loops, of course, that will continue to loop until you release the key. And the really cool thing about these instruments is, in addition to the actual loops, we have endings. So when you are in a situation where you just need to end, you can just hit another key and you can have an ending that will flow seamlessly from the loop, assuming the MIDI data lines up properly. So both instruments, the loops start on C1, and the loops are all mapped to white keys, and the endings are mapped to black keys. Now this presents a bit of a challenge when you want to have a definitive ending for each loop, being that there are less black keys than there are white keys. So what I did was I made sure that all of the white keys, which is basically B and E, those white keys that don't have a corresponding black key, those loops are similar in nature to the ones that do, meaning F and C. Now you'll find that some of the loops are similar anyway as you go up the keyboard, but I made absolutely sure that E and F are always similar and B and C are always similar, so that the black key F sharp ending can be used with either E or F, and the black key C sharp can be used with a loop that is either on B or C. So this way you don't have a situation where you say, okay, well I really like this loop, but there's no ending. The ending is always going to be there. So let's take a listen to some of these loops from both of these instruments. The first 3 loops are going to have endings, so you can get an idea of what the endings will sound like when they are attached to the corresponding loop. So let's talk about the flexibility you have here and what you can do with these and how you can work with them and how you can sort of make them unique and make them your own. So one of the things you can do, there's actually 2 different ways you can go about doing this. The first way is when you have one of the multi-perc loop instruments loaded, you can open the instrument using the instrument icon, click Selected Groups Only, and then select the group that contains the zones that are currently playing. And with Selected Groups Only and that group selected, you will see only those zones, the stacked zones, that make up the loop that you're hearing. You then have the option to move or delete one or more of the zones. If you, let's say, only want one or two, just get rid of the one or two or three that you don't want, and then you're left with what you do. And you can do that for as many groups as you want. Now, invariably, some people aren't going to like that idea or aren't going to want to work that way, which is understandable. So all of these loops are available in multi-perc loop individual instruments. There's 4 of them, and those 4 comprise all of the loops that make up the other 2 multi-perc master patches, if you will. All of the loops in these 4 instruments are laid out chromatically across the keyboard, starting at C1, and they appear in the same order that they appear in the master patches. So, for example, C1 of the first multi-perc loop patch has 4 zones, which are stacked on top of one another, creating one loop. Well, the first 4 zones in multi-perc loop individual 1 are those 4 loops which are now separated from one another, and you can access each one of those individually without having to do anything other than play your keyboard. So the next 5 zones make up the second loop in the multi-perc loop master patch, which is mapped to C#1, and these 5 zones, as with the first 4, are also accessible individually, and then it just goes on from there and continues the same way up the remainder of the keyboard and on into the next 3 individual patches. So with this in mind, now what you can do is you can basically create your own unique loops by stacking 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever loops on top of one another. And of course you can go from one instrument to another. You can stack a loop from multi-perc loop individual 1 with another couple loops from 2 or 3 of the other individual instruments. And there's a great deal of flexibility there in terms of which loops you want to use. One other thing to keep in mind is you don't have to be limited to just the entire loop. You can also use portions of loops. So where each loop is, let's say, 16 beats long, there's nothing stopping you from using 4 beats from another loop somewhere else, or 2 beats or 8 beats or whatever the amount is from other loops, and you can not only stack 3 or 4 entire loops on top of one another, you can take 2 loops in their entirety and take 3 or 4 or 5 different loops and place them at different parts of the measure and just chop them up so you have 4 beats here, 4 beats here, 4 beats there, and again, a ton of flexibility there. Next up we have our tonal stuff. Comes in 2 different varieties. The first we're going to take a look at are the atonals, which are basically low pulsing syncopated rhythmic arps or arpeggiated rhythms. They are all in D. So every time you hit a key and you get an arp, it'll be D, which we can stretch out, and we'll take a look at that in a bit. It's chromatically mapped, starting at C1 all the way up the keyboard, and they're all similar in the fact that they're just one straight D note going all the way through with very little variation from the pulse that you're actually hearing. Atonals 2 is a bit different. We'll get to that in a second. Let's just take a listen to a few arps from Atonals 1. So whereas Atonals 1 is basically one constant pulsing note, the arps in Atonals 2 have varying rhythmic elements and accents. Let's take a listen to a few of these and you can see exactly what I'm talking about. So all of these atonals appear individually in these atonals individual patches, of which there are 3. They appear in the same order as they do in the so-called master patches, and they are stretched out so you can access different notes other than just D. Here's one example of what you can do. And you of course can do that with any of the atonals. The different samples, or zones, are accessed via the key switches down here at the bottom of the keyboard. Each key switch has 6 samples, or 6 arps, and they are all based around D. So D is the root, and they're stretched in either direction. If you aren't hearing what you want, just hit another key switch, and you then have access to more arps. So granted, this is not the sexiest way of doing this. However, the only other option that I could really think of is put each individual arp in its own patch or NKI file, but then we're going to wind up with 167 separate NKI files, and just to get to each individual arp you'd have to load God only knows how many different NKI files to find the one that you want. So this is how it is for now. Granted, some people are not going to like this. If anybody has a better idea or would prefer that it be done some other way, I'm all ears. Feel free to send me an email and tell me, hey, don't do it like this, do it like this instead. And if the idea seems like a viable one and it's possible, I'll seriously consider implementing it. So it's not necessarily set like this in stone forever. It's just like this for now, at least until I get some feedback and seeing how well people either like this or don't like this, and if anybody has a better method. Now, we have melodic tonals. Melodic tonals are similar to the atonal loops, save for the fact that they are more melodic and they're not, well, atonal. They're mapped chromatically throughout the keyboard. There are 3 of these, and they all are in D, as with the atonal loops. We'll be able to stretch these. We'll get to that in a minute. In the meantime, let's take a quick listen to a few of the melodic tonal loops. So as you can tell, these loops are not only in D, they're also minor. Having loops like this presents a bit of a problem when you want to have either major or minor, or preferably both, and have the ability to go back and forth between the two. Well, problem solved with the mod wheel. When the patch loads, by default, the mod wheel is in the down position, and when you play a key, it will give you a minor tonal loop. Flick the mod wheel into the up position, and you have a major tonal loop, and you can go back and forth between the two at will. All of the loops be it major or minor, are the same. So if you hit, let's say, for example, D2 with the mod wheel in the down position, you get that tonal loop, which is minor. And then when you flick the mod wheel in the up position and you hit D2 again, you get the same loop, only major as opposed to minor. And let's take a listen to what that can sound like. So that's using the individual patches where the loops are stretched. Again, the root is D and they're stretched in either direction. Very similar to the atonals patches, the way they're laid out and accessed via key switches. And you can basically now get real and usable melodies. And you can, of course, switch back and forth between different loops. You don't only have to go from major to minor within the same loop. So we have 5 patches left that we're going to take a look at. The first of those is a piano staccato patch. This is mapped from A1 to C6 with some stretching on either side if you happen to need some of those notes. It is 2 velocity layers, and I've always wanted a staccato piano patch, so I went and created one. These are actual real staccato notes, played staccato. They're not longer notes that have been chopped after the fact. And let's take a listen. So probably not something that you're going to be using every single day of your life, but it's there if you feel the need. And the other thing you can do that's really cool is you can add some of the effects that are in the GUI and maybe get some cool sounds. Next up is a frozen piano patch, which, believe it or not, was not created with the piano staccato patch we just heard. It spans D4 to A7, has 5 velocity layers, and sounds like this. Next up is a reversed patch. This is just me being cute, or maybe not so cute, and it's what you'd expect to find in a reversed patch. The samples are reversed and they sweep upwards, and they're very useful for transitions and going from one part to the next. And the mapping starts at C2, and basically the shorter ones are to the left of the keyboard, and as you go up to the keyboard to the right, they get longer in duration. Let's have a listen. Next is what I'm calling a broken patch, and these sound like this. Finally, we have a screamers patch, which sounds like this. And that about does it. So thank you very much for taking the time to watch. Please visit universalsampling.com for more information and purchasing. And if you have any questions, please send an email to info@universalsampling.com. And I look forward to hearing from all of you. Take care.